What happens when a pilot's prejudice grounds a 500-seat super jumbo jet? On a routine flight from Frankfurt to New York, a decorated captain refused to fly, citing a gut feeling about a black man on her flight deck. She questioned his authority, his credentials, his very right to be there. She was the pilot in command, the final authority on safety and security. But she made one catastrophic mistake. The man she tried to remove wasn't just a passenger or a junior officer. He was the airline's chief training officer, the man who wrote the rules she was now breaking. This is the true story of how one act of discrimination triggered a multi-million-dollar crisis and unleashed a storm of karma that no one saw coming. The air in the flight deck of the colossal Airbus A380 was a sterile, controlled environment. A symphony of quiet hums from the avionics and the soft glow of dozens of screens filled the space, a technological sanctuary suspended high above the chaos of Frankfurt International Airport. For Captain Eva Rostova, this was more than an office. It was her kingdom. With over 20 years in the sky and a command record that was the envy of her peers at Global Sky Alliance, her authority here was absolute. She was a woman of formidable presence with sharp blue eyes that missed nothing and a demeanor honed by thousands of hours of making critical decisions under pressure. Her world was one of checklists, procedures, and unyielding standards. There was no room for ambiguity, and even less for what she deemed unprofessionalism. The final boarding call had echoed through the terminal. Her first officer, a competent but mild-mannered man named Michael Bauer, was methodically running through the pre-flight checklist. Everything was nominal. The catering was loaded, the baggage was secure, and the flight plan was programmed. It was a routine transatlantic crossing to JFK, a route Eva had flown hundreds of times. That's when the knock came. Not the sharp, familiar rap of a cabin crew member, but a softer, more hesitant sound. Michael glanced up, but Eva held up a hand, her focus still on the fuel load calculations. "One moment," she called out, her voice crisp with authority. She initialed the final document on her clipboard and then nodded. "Enter." The door swung open, and a man stepped into the cockpit. He was tall and lean-dressed, not in the crisp pilot's uniform Eva expected, but in a tailored navy blue blazer, a simple white shirt with no tie, and dark trousers. He carried a leather satchel and moved with an easy, unassuming grace. He was also black. Eva's eyes narrowed slightly. A flicker of something annoyance, suspicion, crossed her features before being suppressed behind her professional mask. She scanned him from head to toe, her mind immediately categorizing him. Management Fay Inspector. His relaxed attire didn't fit either mold perfectly. "Good afternoon," the man said, his voice a calm, deep baritone that seemed to absorb the electronic hum of the cockpit. He offered a polite smile. "Dr. Julian Washington. I'm scheduled to observe today's flight." He extended his hand, but Eva didn't take it immediately. Instead, she took the identification he offered from his other hand. Her gaze lingered on the name Dr. Julian Washington, and then on the title below it, Chief Training Officer, Global Sky Alliance. A chief training officer was a rare sight on a routine flight. They were the architects of pilot training, the shapers of protocol, the ghosts in the machine who oversaw the standards for the entire airline. They usually observed simulator sessions or conducted high-level check rides for new captains. A line flight observation, especially unannounced to her, was unusual. "I wasn't informed," Eva stated flatly. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation, an interruption to her meticulously controlled environment. "It was a last-minute addition to my schedule," Dr. Washington replied smoothly, his smile unwavering. I was in Frankfurt for the EASA conference and needed to get back stateside. Operations saw an opportunity to combine it with a standard line check. Kill two birds, so to speak. Michael Bauer, the first officer, shuffled his papers nervously. He recognized the name and the immense authority it carried. "Dr. Washington, it's an honor, sir," Michael said, reaching across to shake the hand Eva had ignored. "Michael Bauer, welcome aboard." Dr. Washington returned the handshake warmly. "Good to be with you, Michael." Eva finally looked up from the ID, her gaze clinical and detached. "Your authorization paperwork, Doctor." Julian raised an eyebrow, the smile finally fading into a neutral expression. "It's all in the system. Operations should have pushed it to your flight package. I prefer a hard copy," Eva insisted, her tone leaving no room for debate. "For the flight log, I need to verify your credentials and your jump seat authorization personally." The air in the cockpit grew thick with unspoken tension. This was not standard procedure. The pilot in command had the right to verify anyone on their flight deck, but the request for physical paperwork in an age of digital logs was a clear power play. It was a way of saying, "Your title means nothing to me. Here you play by my rules." Without a word, Julian Washington unzipped his leather satchel. He was no stranger to this kind of friction. Throughout his career, from his time as a decorated Air Force pilot to his ascent in the corporate echelons of civilian aviation, he had encountered these subtle tests, these moments of questioning layered with unspoken prejudice. He had learned to meet them not with anger, but with overwhelming, irrefutable competence. He produced a folder and handed over a sheaf of papers: his FAA license, his medical certificate, his specific authorization for this flight, and his Global Sky Alliance credentials. Each document was pristine. Eva took them and began her inspection. She didn't just glance at them. She scrutinized them. She held the FAA license up to the light as if checking for a watermark. She cross-referenced the employee number on his airline ID with the one listed on the flight manifest on her tablet. The silence stretched, broken only by the hum of the avionics and a distant boarding announcement from the cabin. Michael Bauer pretended to be engrossed in his own screen, but his posture was rigid. He could feel the palpable animosity radiating from the captain's seat. He had flown with Eva for 6 months. He knew her to be demanding and a stickler for the rules. But this was different. This felt personal. "Your medical certificate is valid," Eva conceded, placing one document down. "Your license checks out." She paused, tapping a finger on the flight authorization form. "It says here, you're cleared for the observer jump seat. Are you current on the A380? "I am," Julian said, his voice still even. "I completed my recurrent simulator training 6 weeks ago. As Chief Training Officer, I'm required to maintain currency on all fleet types." Eva looked up, her blue eyes locking onto his. "Maintaining currency and being proficient are two different things, Doctor. The flight deck of an A380 during a transatlantic crossing is a dynamic environment. My primary responsibility is the safety of this aircraft and the 512 souls on board. Any distraction, any potential for a breakdown in cockpit resource management is a risk I must mitigate." The subtext was as thick as runway fog. You are the distraction. You are the risk. This was the moment the quiet tension solidified into open conflict. She wasn't just verifying his credentials anymore. She was challenging his competence, his very presence. She was using the sacred language of safety to mask an ugly personal prejudice. Dr. Julian Washington stood in the narrow space behind the pilots' seats, the weight of his authority held in reserve. He had allowed her the space to play her game, to build her case, to wrap her intolerance in the flag of procedure. But he could see the dangerous road she was heading down, a road that would lead not to enhanced safety, but to a crisis of her own making. He met her cold, challenging stare, not with defiance, but with an unnerving calm. He had hoped it wouldn't come to this, but Captain Rostova was forcing his hand. "Captain," he said, and for the first time his voice carried a hint of the immense power he wielded within the airline. "Are you questioning my authorization to be on this flight?" Ava lifted her chin, unflinching. "I am questioning whether your presence on my flight deck at this specific time is conducive to the safe operation of this aircraft. As pilot in command, that is my prerogative." The gauntlet was thrown. She had invoked the most powerful phrase in aviation, staking her entire authority on this confrontation. A quiet, almost imperceptible sigh escaped Julian's lips. "I see," he said softly. He reached into his satchel once more, but this time he didn't pull out a document. He pulled out his phone. "Then you leave me no choice. You are creating a situation that requires clarification from a higher authority." He wasn't going to argue with her. He wasn't going to debate regulations on her flight deck. He was going to escalate precisely as his own training manuals dictated. And in that moment, Captain Ava Rostov, Tova gatekeeper of her sterile kingdom, had no idea she had just barred the door to the one man who held the master key. The chain of events she had just set in motion would not end with his removal, but with the complete and utter unraveling of her own carefully constructed world. The silence that followed Dr. Washington's declaration was crystalline. It was the sound of a Rubicon being crossed. Captain Ava Rostova watched as he dialed a number on his phone, her expression a mixture of indignation and grim satisfaction. In her mind, she had successfully cornered a potential threat, an anomaly in her controlled environment. She believed his phone call was a bluff, an attempt by a high-level executive to bully his way past her legitimate authority. She was mistaken. "Hans, it's Julian Washington," he said into the phone, his voice low and steady, yet carrying an unmistakable weight. "I'm on the flight deck of GSA 88, the A380 to JFK. Yes, that's the one. We have a situation here. Captain Rostova has expressed concerns about my presence on her flight deck. No, all my paperwork is in order. She has verified it." Eva bristled. She began typing furiously into the electronic flight log, creating her official record of the event. She used precise, defensible language, a fortress of procedure built to protect her decision. Observer presented on flight deck for line check. PIC noted observer's demeanor as inconsistent with standard flight operations protocol. Citing potential for negative CRM cockpit resource management dynamics and an overriding responsibility for absolute safety. PIAC has requested a final verification of observer's suitability from operations control. She was framing her prejudice as professional diligence. First Officer Michael Bauer watched his stomach churning. He cleared his throat. "Captain," he began tentatively. "Dr. Washington is the head of all training. Perhaps if we just—" "First Officer Bauer." Ava cut him off without looking up from her screen, her voice like ice. "Your duty is to the checklist. My duty is to the safety of this aircraft. Do you see a checklist item for ignoring the captain's direct orders?" "No, Captain," Michael mumbled, shrinking back into his seat. He felt a profound sense of shame, but the culture of the flight deck was a rigid hierarchy. Challenging a captain, especially one with Rostova's reputation, was career suicide. On the other side of the cockpit, Julian continued his call. "I understand the delay is costly, Hans. I assure you I am doing everything I can to de-escalate. However, the captain has made it clear she will not proceed with me on board. She has invoked PIC authority. Yes, I believe it would be best if you came to the aircraft yourself." He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. "The Frankfurt station manager is on his way." He informed them, his gaze directed at both Eva and Michael, treating them as a single crew unit. Eva merely grunted in acknowledgement, her fortress of procedure now fully constructed. She felt secure. The station manager would see her detailed log, hear her concerns articulated in the unassailable language of safety, and would have no choice but to support the pilot in command. 5 minutes later, the cockpit door opened again. Hans Schmidt was a man perpetually frayed at the edges, a fact belied by his impeccably neat Lufthansa Ground Services uniform. He was the airline's operational commander in Frankfurt, responsible for ensuring that hundreds of millions of dollars worth of aircraft departed on schedule. An A380 held at the gate was his worst nightmare. "Captain Rostova, Dr. Washington," he said, his German accent clipping his words. His eyes darted between the unmovable captain and the unnervingly calm executive. "Can someone please explain why my flagship aircraft is burning a hole in my budget?" "Hans," Eva began, her voice taking on a tone of weary professionalism, as if explaining a complex mechanical issue. "As I am sure Dr. Washington has told you, he arrived unannounced. While his paperwork appears to be in order, his presence here is irregular. I have a responsibility to my crew and my passengers. I have a gut feeling, Hans, and in 20 years of flying, my gut has never been wrong. Something about this situation is not right. It compromises the sterile cockpit environment." Hans Schmidt looked at Dr. Washington, who simply stood there, a silent testament to the absurdity of the situation. Hans had seen Eva Rostova's gut feelings before. He knew she was a superb technical pilot, but he also knew her reputation for being rigid and unforgiving, for seeing the world in black and white, with no room for shades of grey. A gut feeling is not a reason to delay a flight with 512 passengers. "Eva," Hans said, his patience wearing thin, "Dr. Washington is the chief training officer for the entire airline. His authority to be here is unquestionable." "On my flight deck," Eva retorted, her voice rising slightly, "the only unquestionable authority is mine. He is an unknown quantity. I will not be pressured into compromising my standards." Hans looked at her, then at Julian, and saw the impasse. He let out a long, suffering sigh. This was no longer a station-level issue. He pulled out his own radio, switching to a secure company channel that linked directly to the Global Sky Alliance Operations Control Center, OCC, in Atlanta. "Atlanta OCC, this is Frankfurt Station Manager Schmidt. I am on the flight deck of GSA 88. We have a Code Bravo situation." Code Bravo, the words hung in the air. It was a designation for a serious non-mechanical, non-security-related delay, often a crew timing out or a medical issue. In this case, it was a pilot refusal. The voice that came back from the speaker was calm and professional, the sound of someone thousands of miles away, looking at a screen that showed their prize asset, sitting stubbornly inert at a German gate. "Go ahead, Frankfurt. This is David Chen on the line." Michael Bauer flinched. David Chen. Not just a dispatcher. Captain David Chen was the chief pilot for the entire Atlantic region. He was a legend in the company, a pilot's pilot who had moved into senior management. He was also known to be a close colleague and friend of Dr. Washington. Eva didn't react at first. The name was familiar, but in her self-imposed bubble of indignation, its significance didn't immediately register. "Captain Chen," Hans said, relief flooding his voice. "I have Captain Rostova here refusing to accept Dr. Washington on her jump seat. She is citing CRM concerns and refusing to take the flight." There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Chen's voice returned, it had lost its detached operational calm. It was now cold steel. "Hans, am I understanding this correctly? You are on the flight deck with the chief training officer of this airline, and Captain Rostova is refusing him access. That is correct, Captain," Hans confirmed. "Put her on," Chen commanded. Hans handed the radio to Eva. She took it, a flicker of uncertainty, finally breaking through her armor of self-righteousness. The name, the tone, the context, it was all starting to coalesce into a terrifying picture. "Captain Rostova speaking," she said, her voice still firm, but a new, almost imperceptible tremor running beneath it. "Eva, this is David Chen," the voice crackled. "I want you to listen to me very carefully. The man you are refusing to let fly is not just an executive. He is the architect of the very CRM protocols you are citing. He literally wrote the book. He designed the A380 transition course you yourself took. He has more command hours on heavy aircraft than any other pilot in this company's management. When he is on your flight deck, he is not an unknown quantity. He is the standard." Each word was a hammer blow dismantling her fortress of procedure, brick by brick. The gut feeling she had wrapped in the language of safety was being exposed for what it was. A flimsy cover for her own baseless prejudice. "David," she started, but her voice faltered. "Do you have any idea what you have just done?" Chen's voice was relentless. "You have taken a routine line check, a sign of trust from the company, and you have turned it into an international incident. You have grounded an A380 based on nothing more than your personal feelings. You have questioned the integrity of the man responsible for the training and safety of every single pilot in this airline, including yourself." There was another longer pause. Eva could feel the blood draining from her face. Michael Bauer was staring at his shoes, wishing the floor would swallow him whole. Dr. Washington stood impassively, his expression unreadable. Then Chen delivered the final devastating blow. "Stand by, Eva. I am conferencing in Maria Santos." Maria Santos, the director of flight operations, Eva's boss's boss, the ultimate authority. Eva Rostova stood in the cockpit of her grounded aircraft, the radio feeling like a block of ice in her hand. Her kingdom was crumbling. The walls of her fortress were collapsing inward, and she was beginning to understand that the person she had tried to cast out was in fact the very foundation of the temple she claimed to be protecting. The drama she had initiated was no longer about her authority. It was about her survival. The air in the cockpit crackled with the static of the open radio channel, a sound that amplified the crushing silence within. For Eva Rostova, it felt as though the very atmosphere was compressing around her. The name Maria Santos, Director of Flight Operations, echoed in her mind. It was a name associated with fleet acquisitions, union negotiations, and congressional hearings. A name from a different stratosphere of the company, one that should never have intersected with a routine flight, no matter how contentious. The voice that finally came through the speaker was female calm and utterly devoid of emotion. It was the voice of pure, dispassionate corporate power. "This is Maria Santos, Captain Rostova. I have been briefed by Captain Chen. Your actions have grounded a flagship aircraft and disrupted the travel of over 500 people. You have professionally maligned the head of our training division and created a multi-million-dollar operational failure based on what has been described to me as a gut feeling. Is that an accurate summary? Ava's throat was dry. The fortress of procedure she had so carefully constructed had been reduced to a pile of rubble. All she had left was the last bastion of a cornered ego defiance. "Director Santos," she managed, her voice strained. "As pilot in command, your authority is delegated to you by this company to ensure the safe and timely operation of our aircraft." Santos cut her off, her voice like a surgeon's scalpel. "You have failed on all counts. Therefore, your command authority on GSA 88 is hereby revoked, effective immediately." The words struck Eva with the force of a physical blow. Revoked. In front of her first officer. In front of him. It was the ultimate humiliation, a public stripping of the rank and identity she had spent her entire adult life building. "First Officer Bauer," Santos's voice continued, shifting its focus. "Do you copy?" Michael Bauer sat bolt upright as if zapped with an electric current. "Yes, Director, I copy. You will assume temporary command of the aircraft. Your orders are to coordinate with Station Manager Schmidt, return the aircraft to the gate, and oversee the deplaning of all passengers. A replacement command crew is being assembled and will be with you in 90 minutes. Do you understand?" "Yes, Director. Understood." Michael said, his voice a mixture of terror and disbelief. "Good. Ava." Santos's voice switched back, the coldness returning. "You will surrender the aircraft logs to First Officer Bauer, collect your personal belongings, and exit the flight deck. A company representative will meet you on the jet bridge. We are done here." The channel went dead. The ensuing silence was heavier and more profound than before. It was the silence of a career imploding. Ava Rostova stood frozen for a long moment, the dead radio still in her hand. Her face was a pale mask of shock and fury. Slowly, mechanically, she placed the radio back in its holder. She couldn't bring herself to look at Dr. Washington. She couldn't even look at Michael. Her gaze was fixed on the windshield on the world outside that was no longer hers to command. It was Dr. Washington who finally broke the spell. He stepped forward, his demeanor unchanged. There was no triumph in his eyes, only a quiet professionalism that was in its own way more damning than any overt celebration could ever be. "Michael," he said softly, addressing the new man in charge. "Let's start with the shutdown checklist. Then you'll need to make a PA announcement. Keep it simple. Ladies and gentlemen, due to an unforeseen operational requirement, this flight will be returning to the gate. No more detail is necessary." He was guiding him, coaching him seamlessly, stepping into his role as a trainer, bringing order to the chaos Eva had created. The irony was devastating. Ava moved like an automaton. She unplugged her headset, wrapping the cord with furious, jerky movements. She pulled her flight bag from its storage compartment, the familiar weight of it now feeling foreign and unearned. Each action was a small, painful ritual of surrender. She didn't say a word. There was nothing left to say. When she turned to leave, she caught Michael's eye. He looked away instantly, a flush of shame and pity on his face. She finally allowed herself to glance at Dr. Washington. He met her gaze, and for a fleeting second, she saw something beyond the calm facade, not anger, but a deep, profound disappointment. Then she was gone, pushing the heavy cockpit door open and stepping out into the jet bridge. The familiar metallic corridor felt alien. At the end of it, waiting just before the gate, stood Hans Schmidt. His expression was grim, his posture rigid. "Ava," he said, his voice low to avoid being overheard by the ground crew. "You are to come with me. You're officially grounded pending a full investigation. Your flight privileges are suspended. We need you to come to the Frankfurt operations office in the morning for a preliminary statement." He began to lead her away from the gate area, down a sterile white service corridor, to avoid the river of deplaning passengers who were just beginning to file out, their faces etched with confusion and frustration. Their ruined travel plans, their missed connections, their disrupted lives, they were all her doing. As they walked under the harsh fluorescent lights of the airport's underbelly, her personal phone, tucked away in her flight bag, began to buzz. She ignored it. It was probably a news alert or a spam call. It buzzed again, more insistently this time. A text message notification lit up the screen. Annoyed, she pulled it out. It was from her younger sister Claire in New York. The message was short, frantic, and stripped of all punctuation. "Call me now. It's Dad." He fell. A cold dread, far deeper and more terrifying than any professional fear, seized her. Her fingers trembled as she fumbled to dial her sister's number. Her father, a wonderfully stubborn and independent 78-year-old, lived alone in a small town near the Adirondacks. "Claire, what's going on? What happened?" Eva demanded the moment the call connected. "Oh, thank God." Claire's voice was a choked sob. "He had a stroke, Eva. A bad one. Mrs. Gable from next door found him. He's at the hospital in Albany. The doctors, they don't know. It's serious." Eva stopped dead in the middle of the corridor, the world tilting on its axis. Albany. Her flight GSA 88 was supposed to land at JFK. She had a connecting flight booked to Albany, planning to surprise her father for a weekend visit. She would have been there in 10 hours. Now she was stranded, trapped in Frankfurt by an ironclad grounding order, caught in the logistical nightmare of a cancelled super jumbo flight that she herself had created. The flight wasn't just a job. It was her way home. It was the lifeline to her father. She looked up at Hans, her face ashen, the full crushing weight of her actions crashing down on her, not as a professional consequence, but as a deeply personal karmic retribution. She had refused to fly because of a feeling in her gut, and now, thousands of miles away, her father's life was hanging in the balance, and she was powerless to reach him. She had reached her point of no return. The sterile white corridor of the Frankfurt airport's service level felt like a tunnel shrinking around Eva Rostova. The professional crisis was a distant hum, drowned out by the roaring panic set off by her sister's text. Her father, a stroke. Albany. The words were disconnected fragments, shards of a new reality that was cutting her to pieces. "I have to get a flight," she said, her voice hollow, turning to Hans Schmidt. The station manager, who minutes ago had been her adversary, now looked at her with a flicker of human pity. "I have to get to New York, now." "Eva, your flight privileges are suspended," he reminded her, his tone softening slightly. "You are grounded. That means you cannot fly as crew." "I don't care about that." She snapped the captain's authority, flaring for a moment before dying out. "I'll buy a ticket. I'll fly as a passenger. I have to get home." Hans nodded slowly. "Of course. But GSA 88 has been officially cancelled. We are trying to rebook over 500 passengers. The next available flight to the New York area is complicated." Complicated was an understatement. As they reached the small, windowless GSA operations office, the logistical nightmare she had single-handedly created became terrifyingly clear. The room was buzzing with frantic energy. Phones rang off the hook. Gate agents, their faces tight with stress, were trying to manage the chaos, rebooking crying families, irate business travelers and tourists whose carefully planned vacations had just evaporated. Eva was now one of them. Worse, she was the cause. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her as Hans led her to an empty desk. She was a pariah. She tried to use her company credentials to access the internal booking system on the desktop computer, but a stark red banner flashed across the screen. Access denied. Privileges suspended. The digital lockout was as final as a prison door slamming shut. She pulled out her personal laptop, her hands shaking as she navigated to the public Global Sky Alliance website. The very airline she had commanded moments before now treated her as just another customer. She searched for flights from Frankfurt to New York or Boston. No flights available. She tried again, expanding her search to include Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., any major hub on the East Coast. Every flight for the next 18 hours was completely booked, filled with the passengers she had displaced. She was trapped in the snarl she had made. Her phone buzzed again. Her sister. Eva's heart hammered against her ribs as she answered. "Did you get a flight?" Claire's voice was thin with exhaustion and fear. "I'm trying. Everything is booked." "How is he?" "He's stable." That's all they'll say. They're doing more scans. Eva the doctor was asking about a living will, about end-of-life directives. I don't know what to tell them. Dad never wanted to talk about that stuff. Eva squeezed her eyes shut. She was the executor of his estate, the one who held all the documents, the one who was supposed to make these decisions. All of it was in a safe deposit box in Albany. Just tell them to do everything they can, Claire. Everything. I'm coming. I promise. She hung up and stared blankly at the screen. A wave of nausea washed over her. She had built her life on control, on navigating complex systems with precision and authority. Now she had no control. She was adrift in a sea of consequences. Hans appeared at her side with a cup of water. "Any luck?" "No," she whispered. "There's nothing." "Let me try something," he said, taking the seat next to her. He logged into the system with his own credentials. His fingers flew across the keyboard, navigating the complex back end of the airline's reservation system, a world of codes and cues hidden from the public. He was a master of this domain, just as she had been of hers. He was silent for several long minutes, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Okay," he said, finally pointing to the screen. "This is not ideal, but it is a way home." He had found a seat. Not a direct flight. It was a convoluted route, a Lufthansa flight to Dublin in 3 hours, a 6-hour layover, and then an Aer Lingus code-share flight to Boston Logan. From Boston, she would have to find her own way to Albany, a 3-hour drive away. "And the seat," he said, hesitating. "It's 42E, middle seat economy class. It's the last one they have." Eva looked at the screen. Seat 42E, a narrow space wedged between strangers in the back of the plane near the lavatories. Just an hour ago, she had been in the left-hand seat of a super jumbo jet, the master of a £500,000 machine. The bitter irony was a physical taste in her mouth. She had refused to share her kingdom with a man of unimpeachable authority, and karma had responded by banishing her to the most undesirable spot in the sky. "I'll take it," she said, her voice barely audible. "Book it." As Hans finalized the booking, taking her personal credit card to pay the exorbitant last-minute fare. Ava leaned back in her chair. The fallout was just beginning. She had grounded a flight out of a feeling of misplaced authority, and in doing so had grounded herself, severing the one connection that mattered most in the world. The journey to seat 42E would be the longest, most agonizing flight of her life. The next morning, the sterile, sunlit conference room at the Global Sky Alliance Frankfurt Corporate Center felt more like an interrogation chamber. Ava sat at one end of a long, polished table, a grim-faced union representative named Carl beside her. Carl had the weary look of a man who had seen too many good careers die in rooms just like this one. "Just stick to the facts, Eva," he had advised her in the hallway. "Don't talk about feelings. Talk about procedure. It's your only defense." But Ava knew her fortress of procedure was already in ruins. On a large screen at the far end of the room were the live video feeds of Maria Santos, Director of Flight Operations, and Captain David Chen, Chief Pilot of the Atlantic region. Their faces were impassive, judicial. Seated next to them was a man Eva didn't know, Robert Thorne, the airline's lead counsel, whose sharp suit and sharper eyes radiated a chilling, predatory intelligence. "Captain Rostova," Maria Santos began, her voice crisp and amplified by the room's speakers. "This is a non-disciplinary fact-finding hearing. We are here to understand the events that led to the cancellation of GSA 88 yesterday. You will have a chance to give your account. First, we will hear from the other parties involved." The first testimony was a written statement from First Officer Michael Bauer. David Chen read it aloud in a monotone. It was a precise chronological account of the events on the flight deck. Bauer described Dr. Washington's arrival, the request for paperwork, Eva's escalating demands, her invocation of PIC authority, and the subsequent grounding of the aircraft. He used neutral language, but the facts themselves were damning. He concluded by stating, "At no point did I feel the operational safety of the flight was compromised by Dr. Washington's presence." His demeanor was professional and courteous throughout the encounter. Eva felt a sting of betrayal, though she knew it was irrational. Michael had simply told the truth. Next came the statement from Dr. Washington himself. It was even more devastating in its objectivity. He didn't mention race or prejudice. He didn't describe Eva's tone or her demeanor. He simply laid out the sequence of events and analyzed them against the airline's own regulations. Regulations, he had written. Captain Rostova's demand for physical paperwork, while permissible, was highly irregular and inconsistent with modern flight deck practices. Chen read from Washington's statement. Her subsequent challenge to my competency based on no objective evidence created a needlessly adversarial environment. The ultimate refusal to fly constituted a fundamental breakdown in cockpit resource management. A captain who creates conflict rather than resolves it represents an unacceptable risk, regardless of their technical skill. Robert Thorne, the lawyer, spoke for the first time. "Captain Rostova," he said, his voice smooth and dangerous. "Is it true that you have logged official safety concerns regarding observers on your flight deck on 2 previous occasions in the past 5 years? Eva was stunned. She remembered the incidents vaguely. One had been a young FAA inspector she felt was too inexperienced. The other was an airline executive from marketing she thought was a distraction. Both times her concerns had been noted and the observers had remained. She had seen it as due diligence. Thorne was framing it as a pattern of behavior. "Those were different situations," she stammered. "I had specific objective concerns about, were either of those individuals people of color?" "Captain," Thorne asked his question, dropping into the room like a stone. "What no? That has nothing to do with this," Eva shot back, her voice rising. "Doesn't it?" Thorne countered, letting the question hang in the air. You have a history of challenging authorized personnel on your flight deck. But yesterday was the first time you forced a confrontation to the point of grounding an aircraft. The only apparent variable was Dr. Washington's race. You may not have intended it, but your actions have exposed this company to significant legal and reputational risk. There are already passengers from GSA 88 posting on social media talking about a racist pilot who refused to fly. The story is leaking. Ava felt the blood drain from her face. She looked at her union rep, Carl, who could only shake his head slowly. "It is now your turn to speak, Captain," said Maria Santos, her voice cutting through the tension. Ava took a deep breath. Her prepared defense built on the flimsy scaffolding of procedure seemed absurd now. All she had left was her record. "Director Santos, Captain Chen," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I have flown for this airline for 20 years. I have a perfect safety record. I have landed damaged aircraft in storms. I have trained dozens of first officers. I made a judgment call. I felt that the integrity of my cockpit was at risk. It was a mistake. In hindsight, a terrible, catastrophic mistake. But it was one mistake in a 20-year career." She paused, looking for some sign of understanding, some flicker of empathy. She found none. David Chen leaned forward, his expression severe. "Ava, your record is what got you command of the A380. Your record is why you were trusted. But your record doesn't excuse your judgment. You didn't just make a mistake. You abused your authority. You weaponized safety regulations to enforce a personal prejudice, whether you admit it to yourself or not. And you did it to the one man in this company who represents the very standard of excellence you claimed to be upholding." The investigation was no longer about facts. It was about an identity. Her entire professional life was being recontextualized, every past success erased by this one monumental failure. She had flown perfectly for 2 decades, but she would be remembered only for the flight she refused to take. The hearing ended. She was told a final decision on her employment status would be made within 48 hours. As she walked out of the room, her phone buzzed. It was another text from her sister. "They need to do surgery. Chances are 50-50. They need your consent. Now." Ava Rostova's journey home was a descent into a private hell. The flight from Dublin to Boston was a blur of enforced proximity and suffocating anonymity. Wedged into seat 42E, she was just another face in the crowd, her internal chaos a stark contrast to the bored indifference of the passengers around her. Every announcement from the flight deck, every gentle chime of the seatbelt sign, was a painful reminder of the world she had lost. During the flight hovering over the Atlantic, in the dead of night, she used the expensive sluggish Wi-Fi to give frantic, tearful consent for her father's high-risk surgery. She landed in Boston exhausted and emotionally shattered, then navigated the indignity of customs and the chaotic search for a rental car. The 3-hour drive to Albany was fueled by stale gas station coffee and pure adrenaline. She arrived at the hospital looking like a ghost. She hadn't slept in nearly 48 hours. Her clothes were rumpled, her hair was a mess, and her eyes were wild with fear and exhaustion. She found her sister Claire in a sterile waiting room, her face pale and tear-streaked. The reunion was not a comfort. "Where have you been?" Claire asked, her voice raw with accusation. "I've been here alone for 2 days, Eva making impossible decisions while you were..." "Where?" "What was so important? My flight was cancelled. There were complications." Eva said the words, feeling pathetic and inadequate. "Complications?" Claire let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "The whole world seems to know about your complications. My friend sent me a link. An aviation blog. They're calling you Captain Karen. Is that what this was about? You threw a fit and grounded a plane because you didn't like someone. The casual cruelty of the nickname, the public shame bleeding into her private grief, was too much." Eva flinched as if struck. "It wasn't like that." "Then what was it like?" Claire demanded, stepping closer. "Because Dad is in there, fighting for his life after a craniotomy, and you were a hashtag. You know what the doctors said? They said stress is a major contributor to this kind of stroke. And do you know what he was stressed about? The reverse mortgage on the house. The one you were supposed to help him figure out last month, but you had to reschedule because of a critical training mission in Hong Kong." Each word was a nail hammered into Eva's conscience. The training mission. She remembered it now. She had pushed off the visit home, promising to handle the complex financial paperwork on this trip. The trip she had just sabotaged. Her father's health crisis wasn't just a terrible coincidence. It was tied directly to the life she had prioritized over him. "You were always too busy," Claire said, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "Too important. Flying your big fancy planes, playing God in the sky. You were never here on the ground where we actually needed you." The accusation hung in the air, unanswerable. Because it was true. Before Eva could find a response, a doctor appeared in the doorway. "He's out of surgery," he said, his expression guarded. "It was a success in that we relieved the pressure on his brain. But the damage is extensive. The next 72 hours are critical. He's in the neuro ICU. You can see him but briefly." The ICU was a place of quiet, rhythmic beeping. Her father lay unnaturally still in the bed, a web of tubes and wires connecting him to the machines that were keeping him alive. A white bandage was wrapped around his head. His face, usually so expressive and stubborn, was slack and pale. He looked smaller, fragile. Eva stood by his bedside, a wave of guilt so profound it was physically nauseating washing over her. She reached out a trembling hand and touched his, the skin cool and foreign. This was the cost. This was the karma. It wasn't just the loss of her job. It was the loss of precious, unrecoverable time. It was the stark, brutal realization that while she was busy guarding her trivial kingdom in the sky, her real world, the only one that truly mattered, was falling apart. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. She knew without looking what it was. An email. The 48 hours were up. With a sense of grim finality, she opened it. The subject line was stark, regarding your employment with Global Sky Alliance. The message was brief, formal, and utterly final. Following a comprehensive review, breach of company protocol, abuse of command authority, actions resulted in significant financial and reputational damage. Effective immediately, your employment with Global Sky Alliance is terminated. Termination. She read the word, but it barely registered. Her career hadn't ended with this email. It had ended in that cockpit in Frankfurt. This was just the official death certificate. She looked from the cold, impersonal words on her phone to her father's still form. The unraveling was complete. She had lost everything. Her wings, her authority, her pride. And now she was terrifyingly close to losing him too. The months that followed were a blur of antiseptic smells, hushed consultations, and the grueling, unglamorous work of caregiving. Eva Rostova, the former A380 captain, now found her days dictated not by flight plans and weather patterns, but by medication schedules and physical therapy appointments. Her father survived, But the man who emerged from the shadow of the stroke was not the one she knew. The stroke had stolen his words, leaving him trapped in a frustrating silence, and had weakened his entire right side. He was dependent. He needed help with everything. After a tense, tear-filled reconciliation, Claire returned to her own life, her own family, leaving Eva to take on the primary role of caretaker. She moved into her childhood home, sleeping in her old teenage bedroom. Her life contracted to the four walls of the small house and the corridors of the rehabilitation center. Her savings, once earmarked for a comfortable retirement, were now draining away to cover medical bills and daily expenses. Her career, her identity was gone. One crisp autumn afternoon, 6 months after the incident in Frankfurt, she was sitting by her father's bedside, patiently helping him with his lunch. It was a slow, messy process. He would often get frustrated, his eyes welling up as he failed to control the spoon. Eva had learned a new kind of patience, a quiet, steady presence that was the polar opposite of the crisp, commanding authority she used to wield. In that moment, she wasn't Captain Rostova. She was just a daughter feeding her father. And for the first time in a long time, it felt right. It felt real. The mail arrived, and with it a thick cream-colored envelope bearing the Global Sky Alliance logo. Her stomach clenched. Was it from the legal department? Another bill. With trepidation, she opened it. Inside was not a legal document, but a handwritten letter on heavy cardstock. The handwriting was elegant, precise. Eva, it began. I imagine this letter is the last thing you expected to receive. I am not writing to re-litigate the events of that day in Frankfurt. The consequences of those actions have run their course, and I take no satisfaction in the outcome. I am writing because I believe that even from our worst failures, there are lessons to be learned not just for the individuals involved, but for the systems they are a part of. Your actions, however misguided, exposed a vulnerability in our command culture. They forced us to confront uncomfortable questions about PIC authority stress and unconscious bias. As a direct result of that day, I was tasked with developing and implementing a new mandatory training module for all command staff. It's called the Human Factors Command Course, and it goes beyond procedure to address the biases and pressures that can lead to catastrophic judgment errors. Ironically, your failure has likely made us a safer, more self-aware airline. It has forced a conversation that was long overdue. I do not know what your life is like now, but I do not believe that one mistake should define a person's entire character. I hope you find a new purpose, a new flight path that brings you peace. Sincerely, Dr. Julian Washington. Eva read the letter twice, then a third time. Tears welled in her eyes, but they weren't tears of shame or anger. It was a strange, complex feeling of absolution and profound irony. The man she had wronged, the man whose career she could have destroyed with a false accusation, had responded not with vengeance, but with progress. He had taken the ugliness of that day and used it to build something better. She looked over at her father, who had finally managed to get a spoonful of applesauce to his mouth by himself. A small, triumphant smile touched his lips. Eva smiled back, a genuine, unburdened smile. Her reckoning had not been about punishment. It had been a violent, painful, and deeply necessary course correction. She had been stripped of the rank and the uniform that she thought defined her, only to discover the person she was meant to be underneath it all. Her world was no longer a kingdom at 38,000 feet. It was a small house in upstate New York. Her mission was no longer to command a multi-million-dollar aircraft, but to help her father relearn how to hold a spoon. It was a smaller life. It was a quieter life. But as she wiped a smudge of applesauce from her father's chin, she knew with a certainty she hadn't felt since she last sat in a cockpit that it was a far more important one. She had finally come home. The story of Captain Eva Rostova is a powerful real-life lesson in humility and the devastating speed of karma. It shows how one person's prejudice, cloaked in professional authority, can trigger a catastrophic chain of events, destroying a celebrated career and causing a crisis that ripples from a single cockpit across the globe. But it's also a story of redemption. It reminds us that sometimes losing everything we think we want is the only way to find what we truly need. It's a story that proves that our true character isn't defined by the height of our success, but by how we respond when we are brought crashing back down to earth. If this story moved you, please hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and be sure to subscribe for more true stories about life consequences and the lessons we learn along the way. Thank you for watching.